Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So today we're going to take up the next gate, which is 75, in our stroll through the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And again, this text shows up as the 11th fascicle of the 12th fascicle version of the Shobogenzo, and it's a piece of a larger text. So Dogen didn't write this thing, but he made a few comments about aspects of this thing. So we've been going one gate per week and seeing what those gates have to say to us. So we're moving now into a section on the Eightfold Path. So the Eightfold Path, of course, is pretty familiar to us. One of the first things we encounter in this tradition, one of the central teachings of this tradition. So the gate statement for today says, right view is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we attain the noble path on which the superfluous is exhausted. So in its broadest sense, right view is anything that moves us toward wholesome behavior, towards skillful behavior, skillful activity, moves us toward letting go of the three poisons, experiencing awakening, not attaining, acquiring, getting something we don't have, just experiencing awakening. So that's opposed to mistaken views, or views that are grounded in three poisons, or grounded in delusion, or things that lead us to actions that create suffering for ourselves or for other beings. So that's a pretty common sense way to think about right view. Things that are wholesome, things that move us toward experiencing awakening. More specifically, traditionally, right view is a deep understanding basically of what the Buddha taught. And what gets mentioned most are things like cause and effect, or karma. Our actions have consequences, understanding that what we do has some consequence in the world for ourselves and for other beings. Also frequently mentioned are the three marks of existence. So just understanding deeply that everything is impermanent, that clinging to things is a source of suffering, and that nothing has a fixed permanent self-nature. So basic emptiness, right? So three marks of existence. Also frequently mentioned dependent origination. Everything arises from something else. Understanding, that causes and conditions come together, and out of that intersection, something arises. So most especially when we're talking about understanding what the Buddha taught with regard to right view, Four Noble Truths, because it's the basis for everything else. So, of course, we know Four Noble Truths explain the nature of suffering, how suffering arises, what we can do about suffering. That's really the most basic teaching we have. So again, Four Noble Truths, all of life is characterized by suffering, and that suffering is the result of our cravings and aversions and attachments and wanting things and not wanting things. That dynamic causes us to chase after the things we want, run away from things that we don't want. And there is a way to liberate ourselves and all beings from that kind of suffering, and that's to engage in the practices of the Eightfold Path. So those Four Noble Truths are some of the first things that we learn in this tradition. And when we're thinking about right view, talking about right view, mostly what comes up is how deeply we understand what Buddha taught us about those Four Noble Truths. So Hojo-san has this summary of the Eightfold Path. He says, the fourth noble truth, the way to eradicate the causes of suffering, is the Eightfold Noble Path. To follow this path, we must view things correctly, base our thinking on reality instead of egocentricity, speak truthfully, act in accord with the right view, engage in a wholesome livelihood, make diligent efforts, and practice right mindfulness and meditation. The Buddha gave us these 8 guidelines for our practice. This teaching and the practice of the middle way to which the Buddha awakened are the shelter and foundation of our life. So the Eightfold Path is what Buddha talked about in his first sermon. So it's one of the things that he understood sitting under the Bodhi tree, had his awakening experience. One of the very first things he talked about was the Eightfold Path. So it's often depicted as a wheel. When we see a diagram of the Eightfold Path, we often see it as a wheel without a beginning and end. We could say really that all of the elements of this Eightfold Path arise together. So it's tempting to look at it in a linear way. Yes, and. These things are not actually separable. We can't actually pull them apart. And yet we say, the first element of the path is right view. If you look at a list of these things, The first thing is always right view. So, we need a certain amount of right view, if you will, in order to get started in our practice. We need a certain amount of understanding just to establish a practice and engage in all of the aspects of this Eightfold Path. So, right view is the first element of that path, because all the rest of those activities have right view as a foundation. The Gate statement says, with right view we attain the noble path. So if we don't have some at least beginning basic understanding of what Buddha was talking about, it's very difficult to engage in the rest of it. So in that way, yes, right view, we could say, is the first step on that path, if you want to turn it a bit linear. It makes sense we're going to have difficulty with the rest of this path if we don't have some insight into, some experience with the Four Noble Truths. So that fourth truth is the Eightfold Path, which includes right view. So we come around again. So right view is really important in experiencing and awakening and liberating beings. But by itself, of course, it's not enough. There's a reason there are 7 other elements on this path. So right view is important, but it's one of a constellation. So right view is supported by all the other elements of this path, and it also supports them. So all of these 8 elements are in conversation with each other all the time. There's this, sort of dynamic interchange between all of these elements all the time. So right view is what helps us understand what our practice is and what we do. Right view is where our attitudes and our values and our worldviews start. So yes, within the practice, but of course then also within the rest of life, because there's no dividing line between what we do here, right, and the rest of our lives. So this is where our whole perception of the world starts, our whole understanding of the world. It's how we determine what we say and what we do, and to some degree, thinking leads to speech, leads to action. So, it kind of determines that whole unfolding, whether those things are skillful or not. Are our thoughts and actions and words skillful or not, wholesome or not? This is where it all starts. It starts with right view. So right view shapes how we see the world and how we see ourselves as a part of that world. So it's not only my perception of what's out here, it also shapes what relationship do I think I have with the rest of this one unified reality. What part do I play? Where are my connections? So holding right view and seeing reality clearly leads to one set of actions. Holding mistaken views that are covered over by delusion, misperception, misunderstanding leads to another set. So those actions have consequences, and they lead to that further unfolding of karma. So here we are again with the causes and conditions. So Buddha says there is no single factor that's so responsible for the arising of unwholesome states, and I would say then potentially unwholesome behavior, and the suffering of beings, as mistaken views or wrong views. So no factor is so helpful then for the arising of wholesome states and healthy behavior and skillful behavior and well-being as right view. So right view is quite important. So right view helps us get started on the path, but we don't leave it behind as we continue to practice. It's not like, well, we achieve right view and then we move on, and then somehow it doesn't matter anymore. Our understanding of right view itself deepens as we practice and becomes more subtle as we walk this path, engage in these elements. So the wheel keeps turning. There isn't a beginning or an end. So we start with a little bit of right view. We start to practice. We get a deeper understanding of right view. It fuels the practice. So we have this turning of the wheel. So it's not we do right view once and then we're done. Right view might be kind of the gateway, if you will, but it continues to develop. It continues to become more and more subtle. Early on in my practice, I remember hearing, I probably told this story, I remember hearing one Sunday morning, somebody asked the teacher who was speaking, so the more you practice, do the questions change? And she said, no, but they become more subtle. So the questions don't go away, right? We're continuing to develop right view. Our right view becomes more subtle. Those questions don't disappear. They probably don't get completely resolved, but they become more subtle. So the Eightfold Path is divided into 3 sections, as we know. We have prajna or wisdom, we have shila or ethics, and we have samadhi, for us, zazen, concentration. Right? So right view falls into this first section on wisdom. This is one of the elements of wisdom. So there are 2 kinds of knowledge that are connected with right view. There's, the conceptual one, which is the intellectual piece. We can understand what Buddha taught pretty easily. What he was saying was when we break it down, pretty common sense, at least in the early teachings. If we read what he says, things make sense. We know what the words mean. Intellectually, we understand what he's talking about. We engage in some Dharma study. We read what teachers and ancestors and other practitioners have said about the Dharma, about the practice, about this one unified reality, because in the beginning, we don't have personal experience of seeing the way Buddha sees. We kind of have to have it described. We kind of have to have somebody pointing out what that is and what it looks like, because we don't personally see that way yet. So a little study is important. We do some discernment, we do some reflection on what we read and what we hear, and it shows up. It starts to show up in our own experience. We start to verify. Dogen uses words like verify. We start to verify. Yeah, that is the way the reality is. In the beginning, we can't see it. As we study, as we practice, as we actually live that Eightfold Path, we have some personal insight, some personal understanding. So this isn't a dry kind of academic understanding that's about like memorizing stuff. We don't sit down and memorize the Pali Canon. We could do that. Maybe there's a reason to do that, but that's not the kind of understanding, the kind of knowledge that we're talking about here, even though we're talking about something which is conceptual. It's conceptual because it's not yet my personal experience. So there's an element of faith involved too, that motivates us to establish a practice. There's a certain amount of faith that yes, this is a wholesome thing. Yes, this is something human beings can practice. This is rooted in bodhicitta. It's rooted in our aspiration to live like bodhisattvas and to see the way Buddha saw and to be skillful in the world. So the other kind of knowledge connected with right view is experiential. So this is the knowledge we have when we directly, deeply experience what Buddha saw and what he's telling us about and what he's teaching us about. So he's pointing us towards something. When we have some personal experience of that, then that knowledge becomes experiential, moves away from something which is only conceptual. So the activities of the Eightfold Path are aimed at moving us from this base of a conceptual right view toward an experiential right view. So Bhikkhu Nanamoli was a translator of the Pali Canon into English, and he says, if conceptual right view can be compared to a hand that grasps the truth by way of concepts, then experiential right view can be compared to an eye. The eye of wisdom that sees directly into the true nature of existence, ordinarily hidden from us by our greed, aversion, and delusion. So the three poisonous minds, right? So the conceptual view is the hand is grasping something I read, something someone told me. The experiential view is I see it myself, right? I see through or past the three poisonous minds, and I get to see that thing for myself. So I mentioned that one important aspect of right view is seeing cause and effect, how one thing arises from another, how nothing comes into being independently of something else. That pattern shows up, of course, in the Four Noble Truths. So we have craving and aversion, it leads to suffering. Abandoning craving and aversion leads to lessening of suffering. So we have cause and effect. Also, we see this in the 12-fold chain. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the 12-fold chain of dependent origination. Craving leads to clinging, leads to feeling, leads to sense, contact, perception, right? We go down that whole path. So we really see one thing rises from another. It's a pattern that is very common in this tradition. If we start to study what Buddha said, what ancestor said, it's one thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. So conditions are not something which are somehow magically created, imposed. My suffering is not something which is created out here and imposed on me. I have some hand in the causes and conditions for that. So this whole cause and effect, causes and conditions teaching permeates our tradition. So the basic teaching is, when this is, that is. When this is not, that is not. It sounds pretty common sense, right? But is that the way we typically see things? Or is it more like, I blame this over here for my conditions? Something arrived in my life, which is affecting me. I either like it or don't like it, but somehow I don't have any hand in it. Well, when this is, that is. When this is not, that is not. So, things give rise to other things. If those causes aren't there, then whatever is resulting is also not there. So seeing conditionality is a foundation of right view. When suffering arises, there's a cause for suffering. If I look deeply at the cause for suffering and I can do something about that, namely, work on my craving, aversion, desire, clinging, grasping, I can lessen suffering. So it's actually quite an encouraging teaching. It's not like there's the First Noble Truth says, life is characterized by suffering. And if we stop there, we go, why do we get out of bed? My life is characterized by suffering. What's the point? Well, when we get down through all the Four Noble Truths, the point is there's something we can do about that. Because of causes and conditions, there's something we can do about that. If we see this with right view, there's a reason to practice, right? There is something we can do about our suffering and about the suffering of all beings. So we can look closely at each thing that arises to learn about it, to study it, to become familiar with it. We can tell pretty quickly that it's not actually disconnected from everything else. It's not actually independent, and this is what Buddha saw when he sat down under the Bodhi tree. And he worked backwards from suffering, right? Okay, there's suffering. Where does the suffering come from? What can we do about the suffering, right? So this is his awakening process. So where we've encountered right view in a couple of previous gates, it's been with regard to discussions about compassion. So right view naturally leads to compassion because we see both how suffering arises in beings, ourselves and other beings, and that we're not disconnected and independent from them or from the rest of the planet. So if we see how suffering is arising for people, we see that we're not disconnected from that. Compassion naturally arises. This is not something we have to go out and get. If we have right view, compassion is there. If we have wisdom, compassion is there. So along with compassion, of course, comes a less self-centered worldview. I see beings are suffering. I see I'm not disconnected from beings. I become a little less self-involved. We're a little bit better able to see how we're driven by the three poisons and how that results in clinging to self. Five skandhas clinging to five skandhas. So Hojo-san says, I think our way of viewing things is upside down. We think we're the most important within this world, that this world is our possession, but actually we are a very small part of nature. What we should do is turn it over and see the right position of ourselves in nature. This is what Buddha taught us, right view. This is what Buddha taught as right view in the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the way we can live together with all beings. So again, right view shapes our experience of the world, right? How we fit into it, which is really basic. It's pretty foundational to our practice. So right view of self as empty, impermanent, ungraspable, all those things, also as one completely interconnected node in the network rather than the thing at the top of the pyramid that's calling all the shots or that owns everything or that directs everything. There's a difference in that picture, right? It's different to be the node, the thing at the top of the pyramid, or to be one node in an interconnected network. So we can shift how we see the world and how we see our place in the world. So centralizing, clinging to right view is also a mistake. So clinging to any view is a mistake, of course, because views change all the time, even views about Dharma, even views about our practice. Things become more subtle, things shift around a little bit. So we've not yet talked about the second half of this gate statement, right, which describes the Eightfold Path as a place where we drop the need for adding extra stuff into our experience of this moment. So again, our gate statement says, right view is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we attain the noble path on which the superfluous is exhausted. So there are two ways to think about this connection, I think, between right view and what's extra. One is that if we really get what Buddha's saying, we can see that we don't need to go looking for things or people or sensations or something to make us happy and to remove our suffering. We see that that's not going to work. Those things are kind of beside the point when it's desire itself that's creating the suffering. So if desire is at the root of the suffering and our treatment of that is, I'm going to desire more stuff, logically we can see probably isn't going to work, or at least isn't going to work in the long term, right? In the short term, I'm happy to get more chocolate cake. In the long term, it's not going to remove all of my suffering. So we also don't need to run around trying out various kinds of spiritual practices, looking for the one that's going to save us from ourselves. All we have to do is deeply investigate the Four Noble Truths, take up the Eightfold Path. There it is. Buddha says, that's it. That's all we need to do. So ironically, clinging to an idea about the Four Noble Truths is itself extra. clinging to an idea about that is superfluous. It isn't the same as the actual alive unfolding of the Four Noble Truths in this moment, here and now. It's my idea about what's going on, my idea about Four Noble Truths, which is not the same as what's going on with the Four Noble Truths in my being right now. So if I try to catch what reality is in this moment, and I try to pin it down, I take the freshness out of it, I take the life out of it, because as soon as I grab it, too late. Because impermanent dynamic reality has, it's going to move on. If I grab this thing, reality's moved on. It's left me behind. So what I have is some kind of a dead thing here, which is just my idea about this one unified reality, about these Four Noble Truths, about this practice of these things on the Eightfold Path. It's already left me. It's already gone. And I'm clinging to this thing, which isn't helpful. So my view is already obsolete. My view is already superfluous. To grab that and cling to it is already something extra, even though it's about my practice, even though it's about this really important teaching of the Buddha. If I grab it and I cling to it, I've already missed the mark, right? I've already gone off the rails. So Hojo-san tells a story about visiting Japanese friends in the US, and he looked at an atlas. The kids in his family had an atlas, and he was looking at their atlas. And he was surprised because he saw that the US was depicted as the center of the world. So, here's an atlas made in the US. And he looks at this, and of course, the US is the center of the world. He's surprised by this. He realized that it's always true that wherever we are, our view is we are the center of the world. So, even though the earth is round, there aren't any corners or centers or, sides or edges or something. Somehow, wherever we are, we think that's the center of the world. That's the center of the universe. So I suppose in Japan, the atlases all have Japan as the center of the world. But in this case, it was in the US. So we all have this view. And so we can see how easy it is to step on each other. If each of us thinks, I'm the thing at the top of the pyramid, rather than I'm a node in the interconnected network, we can see how easy it is to create suffering, right? And to step on each other. We can forget that we actually live in that network of interdependent origination, because to us, the map always looks like the place we are is the biggest or the most important, right? So we have this distorted view. So Hojo-san says, because an atlas or a map is flat, it has only two dimensions, so something's always distorted. The world created by thought is the same. The shape, size, or directions are not like the real thing. Our view is distorted by our egocentricity. If we think the map is real and accurate, we make a mistake. Our own view is an incomplete copy of the world we experience. If we grasp our view as the absolutely right view, we make a mistake. We cannot live harmoniously with others whose maps of the world are created by their own karma or conditioned experiences. When we study how an atlas is made and how it is distorted, it becomes a useful tool for understanding reality. We study how our views are formed, then we can try to correct the distortion. So I think this sentence is important. Our own view is an incomplete copy of the world we experience, right? This is me grasping my idea about the Four Noble Truths and thinking I've got it. Meanwhile, the world has moved on. So our idea of the world might not actually be the same as the world. It's our idea. It's a copy, right, of what the world is. So our idea of right view might also not be the same as what right view is. We keep peeling that onion, right? It's so easy to get stuck. Oh, here's the answer. It's right view. Here's my right view. That already doesn't mean anything. We've already missed the mark. So in the end, we even have to put aside our idea about what right view is. So right view is not to cling to a right view, right? So we have to go beyond distinctions even between right view and what is mistaken view, what is deluded view. How do we even leap beyond labeling that, right? If we're trying to decide what right view is so we can practice right view, and yet we're also told how we need to leap beyond distinctions between right view and mistaken view. How do we hold those two things? That's an interesting intersection, right? So holding a fixed idea about the world is one of those superfluous things from this Gate statement, the second half of this Gate statement. And so is holding a fixed idea about right view. So we get to open the hand of all of those superfluous things. We don't need to have an idea. We don't need to write a story. We just do the practice. So Dogen tells a story in the Tenzo Kyokan. Shui Feng Yitsun was once the Tenzo under Dongshan Manjie. So this is a monk who's working under an abbot. One day while Shui Feng was washing the rice, Dongshan happened to pass by and asked, "Do you wash the sand and pick out the rice, or wash the rice and pick out the sand?" "I wash and throw away both the sand and the rice together," Shui Feng replied. This is a kind of a famous story, because people know the Tenzo Kyokan pretty well. So rice, of course, is the valuable thing in this story. So the Tenzo is the cook, right? So he's preparing food. And the abbot comes by and sees that he's washing rice and says, "Do you wash the rice and throw out the sand? Or do you throw out the sand, wash the sand and throw out the rice?" So rice is the valuable thing because it's edible as nice food, right? Rice makes nice food. Sand is an impurity. It's not edible, it doesn't feel good in your teeth, you don't want to have that in your food. So cleaning rice is an everyday activity, really, in the training temple. I recall sometimes a small group of us would be sitting around picking through the rice, picking out the bugs and the sand and the pebbles and whatever was in there, right? This is an everyday activity. So what Shui Feng is doing here is not an exotic practice. He's simply doing the work of the Tenzo on a moment-by-moment basis, picking through the rice. So Dongshan is asking Shui Feng, in your everyday activities, do you sift through your mistaken views and look for right views, and keep those and cultivate those? Or do you look through your awakened views for delusion and try to get rid of those? Right, so of course this is highly metaphorical. So Shui Feng says that without negating the existence of either mistaken view or right view, he goes beyond that distinction. And he throws out ideas of either right view or mistaken view. So he's washing the rice and the sand and throwing them both out, throwing out distinction. So again, one day while Shui Feng was washing the rice, Dongshan happened to pass by and asked, "Do you wash the sand and pick out the rice, or wash the rice and pick out the sand?" "I wash and throw away both the sand and the rice together," Shui Feng replied. So he's leaping beyond distinction. So anything we add to the direct experience of this reality is extra. This is not new teaching for us, right? We hear it all the time. We hear it in Zazen is good for nothing. We hear it in, we only do 4 things in Zazen, we only do 3 things in Sesshin, right? So we really want to get down to what are the important things and what things are superfluous, as this Gates statement says. So if we watch ourselves carefully, we might see that we often want to add something to a situation to make it better. Somehow it's not enough. It's either not good enough or something. So we want to add something to make it better. This would all be okay if only, fill in the blank. If only something was like this, if only things were different, if only I had, if only I didn't have. What we usually mean is this would all be okay for me, if only, ... So in order to make it okay for me, I choose to see only this aspect of the situation, or only these characteristics of mine or of somebody else, or I write a story about how I wish things were so I could ignore how things really are. So it's ironic that ignoring stuff is actually extra, right? If we truly completely see this moment the way Buddha saw it, ignoring stuff is extra. Ignoring stuff is an activity, right? Ignoring stuff is a choice. Maybe it's not a choice we're completely aware of, but it creates karma. It's an action. I'm choosing not to see these things. I'm choosing not to accept this part of reality. It's an activity we do, and it's extra. So actively ignoring stuff is not the same as letting go of thought. That's a pitfall we need to be careful about, right? Actively choosing to ignore something is not the same as saying I'm letting go of thought. If I'm letting go of thought, I'm accepting what's here and I'm not making a story about it. I'm not choosing to do anything with it. I'm not engaging with it, not craving it, not having aversion to it, not chasing, not running away. So ignoring stuff means we're engaging with stuff. I have a perception about this thing. I'm labeling it good or bad. I'm giving it a name, and I'm saying, go away, right? So letting go of stuff means we stop engaging with it. We don't have to actively push it away. It's here. The reality is it's in my life. That doesn't mean I don't take some skillful action about it. It doesn't mean I tolerate a toxic situation if that's what's going on, but I'm not ignoring it, right? So there's this subtle difference. So we need to deeply understand what letting go of thought actually is. Letting go of thought doesn't mean pushing away thought. Letting go of thought means I let it all in and I don't make a choice about it. I don't make a story about it. So usually ignoring stuff is about protecting these 5 skandhas, right? If we have right view and we really understand what Buddha was saying about suffering and the nature of self, then we don't have to protect the 5 skandhas. We can see that doing that is superfluous. There is no self we need to shore up. There is no self we need to, protect from the world, right? Doesn't mean we become doormats. Does not mean we become martyrs. That's another whole dynamic. That's still 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas, because that's still me having an idea about what self is. Oh, if I'm really a good practitioner and I'm letting go of self, that means that I should do whatever people ask of me and I don't need to take care of myself psychologically or physically. Not what Buddha taught, right? Because that's an idea about who I think I am. These things are quite subtle. If we have right view, we can see which parts of that dynamic are superfluous. So traditionally, religious speculation is also considered superfluous in this tradition. So when people ask the Buddha about things like whether there was life after death and how the universe began and all kinds of those things, he said, well, I know all those things because I'm Buddha. I know all that stuff. I could tell you. I'm not going to tell you. Why? Because I'm here to teach you about suffering. So all I do is Four Noble Truths. All I do is tell you about suffering and the nature of suffering and how to liberate beings from suffering. And the rest of that stuff doesn't have bearing on our ability to be bodhisattvas in the world. So all that kind of speculation, he says, is extra. We don't need to put our energy there. Put our energy into watching how craving and aversion arise and all the various permutations that go with that. So speculation is also, he says, wondering about somebody else's level of attainment or insight or how they got there. What's going on with somebody else, because people would ask him these things. Oh, do you think such and so teacher really, has awakening, has enlightenment? He goes, don't go there. Not important. Mind your own practice is in essence what he's saying. Buddha said, just put all that aside. Do your best to get to your own right view, to get to your own clarity about these things that I'm talking about. Do your best to see this one unified reality for yourself. And, not so important to worry about what other people are doing. Put your effort into seeing as clearly as you can for yourself and having your own pure, direct experience of this one unified reality. That's where we're kind of headed. So don't worry about what others are doing. Don't speculate about what's going on somewhere else, what's going to happen in the future. We can't take action on any of that. The only thing we have is this moment, this one unified reality, this body and mind. This is the ground of practice, right? This moment is the only place and time we can practice. We can't practice in the future. We can't practice in the past. This is it. So let's focus right here. Anything else is extra. So again, we're back to what this statement says about exhausting things which are superfluous, letting go of things which are superfluous. So finally, let's look at another of Dogen's writings. We looked at the Tenzo Kyokan. Let's look at another one, which is his comment on right view from his fascicle on the 37 Factors of Awakening. So this piece of text is an old favorite of ours, right? We do this every week. So he says, right view, as a branch of the path, is the inside of the eyes containing the body. At the same time, even prior to the body, we must have the eye that is prior to the body. Though the view has been grandly realized in the past, it is realized now as the real universe and is experienced immediately. In sum, those who do not put the body into the eyes are not Buddhist patriarchs. Fortunately, this is a little more easier to understand than last week. We don't have to go too far down the rabbit hole for this one, because he's actually being pretty clear. So the eye that precedes the body is like the eye that precedes the moment that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. It's the same kind of image, right? Again, it's being aware of the space before our habituated thinking kicks in and decides whether sensations are good or bad before we take some physical action with this body and mind in response to that whole thing, right? It's about, seeing the space before that dynamic starts to arise. So we might call it intuition in the sense that we're aware of something without using our sort of conscious intellectual reasoning, but this is not magic. This is not supernatural power. It's simply being very self-aware and knowing very well how we give rise to all of those 12-fold links in that chain of dependent origination. It's about seeing very clearly how I myself create this chain of suffering that we see in the Four Noble Truths, right? It's about being very, very self-aware. So this is not a bolt of lightning. This is not magical power. So Dogen is reminding us that inside and outside, body and mind, subject and object, not separate from the beginning. These things were never separate. Inside of the eye is containing the body. At the same time, even prior to the body, we must have the eye that is prior to the body. These things are not even things we can pull apart. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned Bhikkhu Nanamoli's image of the shift from the hand, which is grasping at stuff, in this case, grasping at views, to the eye of wisdom that sees through the three poisons and experiences Buddha's teachings directly. So we see like Buddha. So there's this shift from the hand that's grasping stuff to the eye that sees clearly. So the eye that precedes the body doesn't negate the body. It goes beyond the distinction between eye and body without negating either one. So this is not saying, well, we need to sort of forget about the body and only see somehow with this magical Buddha eye, right? These things have never been separate. So we don't negate one or the other. They're both here. And also, we don't make a distinction. We can leap beyond the distinction. So it goes beyond the distinction between eye and body without negating either one. And that's how right view goes from being a conceptual exercise to a direct, immediate experience. So we're not negating the conceptual understanding. We might move through a conceptual understanding. It might shift, it might change, it might become more subtle, but we don't negate it, right? This is why I'm saying we don't do this and then leave it behind. We hold both of these things. Both of these kinds of knowledge are important. So it's not about having one or the other, negating one or the other. We have both, and we also don't make a distinction. So right view is not a passive thing. It's not like sitting and looking at the world through a window or looking on a screen and saying, well, that's the sum total of right view. It's not about sort of watching things go by or thinking about the Dharma without getting involved. It's not a study like putting something under a microscope and just observing it out here. So that would be, setting up this separation of subject and object. So right view sounds like, well, there's me and I'm watching something. There's actually no separation there. It's not like I'm being a passive observer of things going by. I'm being an anthropologist watching somebody else's culture. There's very direct connection, very direct involvement. So those who do not put the body into the eyes are not Buddhist patriarchs. So those who aren't manifesting wisdom and compassion and Buddha nature and right view with body and mind are not completely practicing, because practice is something we do. Right? This complete manifestation is something we do. It's not only here. Right view doesn't just exist like there's a picture I see. It's an active thing. So some of you have probably heard previously me talk about the 5 elements of spiritual health. From time to time I talk about the 5 elements of spiritual health. This is not a Buddhist thing. This is quite a Western thing, but I find it helpful. It's sort of a Western sociological, religious thing, but I think it's helpful for us, being Westerners. So one of those 5 things is knowing what we believe and why, which is a question we don't often stop to ask ourselves. What do I believe and where did that come from? Why do I think so? So, it's helpful to think about what shaped the worldview that we're carrying around. How is that reflected in what we think and what we say and what we do? Usually our views are transparent to us. We don't think about having views. The views are just there. The filters are there, right? We assume that our views and our filters are the same as everyone around us, which is one of those reasons why we step on each other, right? Here I am at the top of the pyramid. Everyone probably sees like I do. I don't even think that they don't. I don't even think there's a possibility they don't see like I do. And suddenly we're stepping on each other and we have issues. So this gate is asking us to do that investigation. How closely does my view accord with this one unified reality? If I believe that there's a self called me, why do I believe that? Where does that come from? What reinforces that belief for me? If I think my life circumstances and the things that I own will never change, why do I think so? Why do I think that's true? And how true is that? If I believe that the only acceptable situation is a life which is completely without suffering, how realistic is that? how closely does that accord with my actual experience, and the way this universe actually works? So why do we have the views we have? And are we, operating from right view with an understanding of the way Buddha sees reality? Or are we operating from mistaken views that lead us to take unwholesome action because they're based on three poisons and they're based on our delusion? So what are we carrying around in our hearts and minds? This is what I think this gate is asking us. What are we carrying around in our hearts and minds that's superfluous? So what would you like to say about right view and the way views get in our way or help us or shape us, or things that are superfluous? Mark.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about a lot during this talk was one of the times during the beneficial action workshops. Dr. Lisa Marr, that's right. So she gave, the title of the speech was like, "Can compassion fatigue?" And her answer was no. Like, that compassion itself can't fatigue, because compassion is a facility. It's not like a thing that's like, oh, I have compassion for you. Compassion is something that's like universal. If we have compassion, we have it, or we don't, or we don't have it. And so she says, like, when we're thinking about like our compassion fatiguing, or our tendency to care or do good in the world is something that's fatiguing, it's all these stories that we have wrapped up in the process while we're doing that, right? And so if she's relating to work that she's doing with a patient, it's like, okay, like, I need to save this patient because it's going to have some good for me. Or you can take that back out to make that distinction between like compassion and empathy, where there's been new like kind of research that says like, or a lot of people talking about empathy is sometimes an obstacle to compassion, because empathy is, rather than dissolving the self, it's extending the self elsewhere, right? And so then if we get this idea of helping this person because we really care for them, we want to be on their side, we see them being attacked, like we're drawing deeper into this like story that our ego is writing about how much we're caring for people. And so it's kind of one of those things that kind of relates that back to me of like, of beneficial action. What does it mean to do good in the world? And part of doing good in the world, it seems, is tackling the situation as it is, without all of these like kind of preconceived ideas about what we think the problem is or what we think our relationship to it is. And so that's just what was going through my head in this process.
Well, that's the irony, isn't it? Because as bodhisattvas, we think, well, our job is to go out and liberate beings, go out and ameliorate suffering. And of course, as soon as we think that, we've missed the mark, because we have an idea about what it is to be a bodhisattva. Mm-hmm. So I have this story that what it is to be a bodhisattva is to go out and do good things. And simply maintaining and perpetuating that story is exhausting, right? Because it feels like there's me and I'm giving. And because there's a separation between me and this person who is receiving whatever it is I'm giving, I have to sort of like overcome that distance, which takes some energy. If instead what I understand is we are all nodes in this network, then there's not a me that's doing for somebody, right? And it's counterintuitive, because we would say, well, any religion would say, my goodness, do good for other people. Why would you not do that? Why would anybody think that was a problematic statement? And conceptually, it's completely fine. Of course, we should go out and help people. Of course, we should do good in the world. We should ameliorate suffering. We should save the planet. We should do all these wonderful things. Yeah, but when it comes down to actually doing that activity, if we move to the experiential part of right view, there's no one to help and there's no one doing helping. And that's a tough nut to crack, right? Because we have a lot of ideas about what it is for us or for anybody to do good in the world. But yeah, my friend Tomon, that Mark is making reference to, runs a palliative care program. And she has built this program from a very small start, and she now has quite a large program. So you can imagine during the pandemic how her life has been. If you want to, see the potential for exhaustion, talk to a palliative care physician in the middle of a COVID epidemic. So she has been working on compassion fatigue. She was doing that long before the pandemic hit. I mean, she's been talking about this all over the world for a long time. So she's, and also as a transmitted Dharma teacher, it's an important part of her practice. So when we have the opportunity to hear from someone like that, she's got a really interesting perspective, because this is what she does all the time. And her practice as a bodhisattva is to be a palliative care physician in the middle of an epidemic. So yikes. So she knows whereof she speaks. It's if I imagine she had to get to the point where she deeply understood, if I personally am giving to all of my patients, and we know they're terminal, if she's in a palliative care situation, if she was personally giving at that level all day, every day, she probably couldn't get out of bed. You have to come to the experiential piece that says we're all nodes in the network. There is no me. There is no recipient. There is something important happening here, which is not tied to my idea about who I am and who this recipient is and what I'm doing, right? If we do that, we get rid of the superfluous, or we let go of the superfluous, we actually have the energy to keep going as bodhisattvas. As soon as our ideas get in the way, not only is there the energy of doing the activity, there's the energy of perpetuating that story, which, oh my gosh, when we let go of it, we see how much energy that takes.
My recollection is that she said, toward the end of her talk, is that she was sort of summarizing things, is that when she meets with her group, and they talk to each other, the final words are, we show up, we're clean, we do the best we can.
We show up, we're clean, and we do the best we can. I love it. Because there's so many ways to take that. Clean means nothing extra. Right? We show up, we fully 100% wholeheartedly. I've never heard this before, so I'm riffing now, right? But it really strikes me, because that's our practice. She's talking about caring for patients, but golly, that's our practice as bodhisattvas. We show up. Job one is we show up. We 100% wholeheartedly engage with whatever is going on without thinking, I'm doing this, but my mind is over here. We show up. We're clean, right? Nothing extra. We sit down, we open the hand, we let go of our ideas, we fully meet this moment, we do what's being done, nothing extra. We do the best we can. Right effort. It's totally right effort, right? We give what we can give. We don't have ideas about what that is. We don't say, I should have done better, I should have done more. We do everything we can do in this moment, and we throw it out there, and we let go of it. So we don't have any judgment about how that went. Am I going to get a reward for it? We just give what we can give, And I love it, because that's totally our bodhisattva practice. Thank you for that. Doju, are you leaping in because we see you on our screen?
Oh, I don't know why you see me on your screen. I was just going to say that Hennesis had his hand up.
Okay, good. Let's go to Hennesis. I'm just seeing Doju on my screen, and so I'm thinking he had something to say. Hennesis, after you.
Okay, trying to find the best way to word this. But as you know, I'm very into like the study of ethics and the gray areas of that. And trying to frame this in terms of right view is something that's been going through my head a lot. Like, I'm thinking of the Bhagavad Gita, where there's this whole thing where, there's this war where family members are killing each other and stuff like that, or needing to in order to resolve this thing. And basically the protagonist has the ideas communicated that life and death are delusions, and that the world that we live in is like just sort of like immaterial reflection of that, and that realizing that there's no life and death, and that you have to like do your duty to do the right thing. You need to like kill your family members. And I'm sort of thinking about also how like, and there's other things too, where like even with the pacifism in Buddhism, there's a lot of times where there's like exceptions brought up. And something that I'm thinking is like, oftentimes these are like, well, it's not done out of anger, it's done out of compassion. But whenever I come across these discussions, like the main thing that goes through my head, and I'm just using murder as a extreme case, but it's like oftentimes we construct narratives that we are actually being compassionate when sometimes we might actually not be doing so. I've heard a lot of people criticize like communist revolutions for being more about hatred of the rich than like love for the workers, for instance, and stuff like that, where like we can sort of make these narratives or whatever that justify what we're doing. And how do we recognize, I guess, like that we even are viewing things from a good way where we're not putting that in there? Because it doesn't seem possible to not put in these sort of like extras into any sort of act of ethics we're doing, because the very act of ethics is sort of putting in our worldviews and biases and all these other things. And we always lie to ourselves and create narratives to do this. I just don't know how it's even possible to avoid that, I guess, is sort of what I'm asking. And sorry if this question's malformed, but yeah.
So I think you're right. It's very, very difficult. I have frequently said here, there are very few actions we take that don't have some kind of self-clinging. Even an action which is an otherwise skillful action, right? There's some element of self-clinging because we're human beings, and in this form, we have karmic conditions. So I think precepts is a wonderful example of how we move from a conceptual right view to an experiential right view. So we have precepts that say things like, don't kill, don't kill people, don't take their stuff, don't misuse sexuality, don't do all these things. In the beginning, those things are ideas. We hear these teachings, we say, oh, that's a rule, that's a guideline, I'm not supposed to, tell lies, or I'm not supposed to disparage the three treasures. And we think, okay, in the beginning of my practice, I will take those on board and I will accept those, and I'll post that list of 10 things on my wall, and I will try to live that way. And we take those as something which is imposed from the outside, and it's completely conceptual because it's just an idea. And the more we practice with those precepts, and the more we do some Dharma study and do some Zazen and have contact with the Sangha, we start to really understand what our teachers mean when they say those precepts are descriptions of living an awakened life. Those precepts are not do this, don't do this. They are what happens when, what our life looks like when we see the way Buddha saw. So it's entirely possible that at some point we break a precept for some greater good. Now, how do we know what that is? That's really difficult. Because I think, Hennessus, as you say, 99% of the time we're writing a narrative. We're saying, I'm doing this for a wonderful reason. I'm bringing chocolate today so that everyone can have chocolate. And oh, by the way, I get to have some too. Right? I mean, there's always a little bit of self-clinging. So our challenge is really to look deeply at the motivation, and not only to look deeply at it, but to commit to be honest with ourselves. I frequently say things like, we have to be honest with ourselves about this thing, because we can examine ourselves as a scientific exercise and, see things going on, but we have to accept in a very deeply honest way, this is my delusion. Here it is again. Because otherwise we write those stories and we say, I'm doing this wonderful, compassionate thing, for all these wonderful reasons, when we know back here, and I'm getting something out of it that I want, which is this thing over here. I don't think in this human form there's a way to entirely prevent that. I think this is why, again, there's vow and repentance. We vow as bodhisattvas to liberate beings from suffering, to do the best we can, to show up, be clean, and do our best. And we know at some point we're going to fall down. We know we're going to break precepts. We know we're going to break vows. We know our practice is incomplete, as the way Hojo-san describes this, which I think is really helpful. Doesn't mean we're bad people. Doesn't mean the skillful actions we take are somehow negated. But it means that, if, for instance, we're doing Rakfusatsu every 30 days, we're taking a chance to step back and, okay, how closely does my view of the world accord with actual reality? How right does my right view, right? So what am I actually doing here? And when we see that our practice is incomplete, we can say, you know what? I can see I'm writing that narrative. I'm going to attempt now. I'm going to vow. I'm going to promise. I'm going to try to open my hand and not write that narrative. Is that going to solve world revolutionary problems? Probably not immediately. But where do I practice with this body and mind in this moment, right? This is all I've got to practice with. So I got to start here. So if I think I'm doing a wonderfully compassionate thing, I've already gone off the rails. Because I think this thing has some kind of characteristic, right? If instead I simply meet this moment, I do what needs to be done because I am aware that there is no separation, and yet there are forms. We get to hold both of those things, right? We can't live only in emptiness, and we can't live only in the world of form. So there's form and emptiness and going beyond those things. There's good and bad and going beyond that, which I think is where Genesis is going, or part of where they're going. How do we know what's good and what's bad? And do we need to know that? You know, if we see the way Buddha sees, we don't make a label, a judgment that says this is a good action and this is a bad action. We simply take skillful action. But as limited human beings, if we are constantly trying to write the story about how that works, it's very difficult, right? So we even have to let go of that. So we have to let go of our ideas about right view. And we have to let go of our ideas about skillful action in that way, and yet still take skillful action. So Genesis, there's no easy answer to your question. I'm simply going to acknowledge that the conundrums that you raise are very real. We all have them. We are all working on those questions in some way. They manifest differently for each of us, right? But this thing about how do we know what is right view and what isn't? How do we know what's good activity and unwholesome activity? This is where we practice, right? This is the work we get to do. We get to start right here with this body and mind. Do our zazen work and study, and try to be aware of the energy, the impulses that drive us toward the things that are less wholesome and the things that cloud our view, right? So we can see clearly, I am taking this compassionate action, or I am taking this action, and I have some self-interest, and maybe that's okay, and maybe that's something we want to give some consideration to, right? So you're raising wonderfully difficult questions, so don't give them up. Mark wants to jump in.
The other Mark, yeah. First a comment, and then Genesis question. The comment about you about the maps and the U.S. being at the center. One of the things I have found through life is that a TV show, if it shows a shot from space, you know where it's made when it shows their country as the forefront. Doctor Who, it's always Great Britain. Star Blazers, when I was a kid, it was always Japan. So needless to say, when you see an actual picture of the Earth from like a moonshot or something, and you can't make a single thing out, it's like, where are we in that world? It gets very confusing. So I thought that was an interesting analogy. But let me re-ask Tennyson's question a different way. Because I'm thinking it on a Western thought level, logically, and I know that's failing radically. We are karmic beings. We have habitual thoughts, patterns, and feelings. We don't really have control over that. So think of a person that grows up thinking, with abusive mother, father, whatever, to where psychologically abusive, to where they're saying you're worthless, you shouldn't, you're a mistake, right? That gets ingrained in everything that they do. It seems impossible as a human being to get beyond that and to choose a right action beyond your own karmic circumstances. I mean, it's almost the effect, in this line of thinking, it's almost as if you do need 1,000 million kalpas in order to make some kind of change.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I see the analogy to the four bodhisattva vows, to where it's impossible to do all of this, and yet we still try. And that's the rub, and yet we still try.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we, I mean, it almost seems that right view is meaningless in this way, in that you see that it's there, you try to make that change, but it doesn't seem like it's possible to make that change. It doesn't seem to be possible to actually make a right action, let alone know whether or not something is right.
So if we use that kind of logic in our practice, then everything we are doing would have an objective, right? And our practice would be meaningful or not meaningful, depending on whether we hit the objective. And yet we know there's no objective for our practice. There's a direction, there's an aspiration, there's no goal that says, we hit the goal, now we're done. So I think it's certainly true that change is very difficult. And there's a reason this is a lifelong transformative practice. We've all got some deeply held delusion, which came from who knows where. Could have come from abusive family, but could have come from all kinds of places. You know, things we take in from our culture, things that happen to us, traumatic experience, you know, lots of things shape that worldview. So to see clearly our process is not an easy thing. We're never going to get to the end. For some of us, it requires some health care or some other kinds of resources. And yet, if we wait to practice until we see perfectly, we will never do anything. We will never take action. We have no hope of ever taking a skillful action because we're too afraid to do anything, right? So if this moment is the only opportunity I have to practice, and yet I am a flawed human being because I'm, as you said, I'm a karmic being. So I'm carrying all the results of all my karma and everybody else's karma, and you know, this is not a perfect being, and yet, you know, I need to do something. Because as a bodhisattva, I need to do something. So how do we take that action in this moment, knowing that I may or may not, it may or may not have the result that I want, that I anticipate, that I expect? Your teacher has told me many times how we have to just, because I used to wrestle with this all the time. I want to change things, I want to fix things. And my Sangha, and I can't fix, not this Sangha, I can't fix them. And she was, you have to just, with the best of intention, do what needs to be done, throw it out there and let go of it. And that's so not easy, right? I mean, that doesn't matter if you're in a Sangha, you're in a family, you're in a political arena, you're in your local club, you're, with your friends. You do the best you can do, knowing you're a karmically flawed human being that cannot see the way Buddha sees. You throw it out there and you let go of it. And it's going to do what it's going to do. And chances are there's some self-clinging in there. Chances are there's something we didn't take into account. There's something we didn't know. We've made some kind of mistake, and yet we still have to. So this is the paradox of our practice, right? This is the real conundrum. It's like we know we're going to break precepts. We know we're going to break vows. We know that this is completely clouded by delusion that comes from who knows where, many, many layers, and yet we still have to do something. This is not easy. I think this is one of the reasons why Sangha is important, because we need support and help and encouragement to actually take beneficial action in the world. It's very, very difficult if we're practicing alone. I mean, maybe we had some direct experience of that during the pandemic when we're all sitting home and we can't get together, and we're trying to practice on our own. And goodness knows, we have any number of people who are connected with Sanjin in some way, living in small towns, don't have a Sangha, don't have a teacher, practicing on their own, doing the very best they can. Boy, that is not easy. Your teacher calls that frontier practice, and I know why. That is tough. I think we need Sangha, or we at least need Sangha friends, or some contact with other practitioners to give us some encouragement and to give us some hope, because on the one hand, it's impossible. We're never going to come to the end of that path. That path is a wheel, man. You're never going to come to the end of that thing. There's always some delusion to let go of. There is always some mistake we're going to make. There's always something we wish we could have done or done better, right? If we're trying to do that by ourselves, I think that's really hard. At least if we have a community of practitioners, we have some support, some encouragement. We have people who can reflect back to us, maybe how we're doing. If we have trusted Sangha friends, they can say, do you see kind of where you're going off the rails there? We need that kind of help. And, because in the world, not everybody lives like this, practices like this, may not be able to share with us entirely practice aspiration in this particular way. So there are so many elements to what you're talking about, all of which are important. I think we have to accept that this practice is always going to be incomplete. That's why we have the owner pins. I think we have to accept that as we do the very best that we can when we show up. We have to throw what we're doing out there and open the hand. And I think we have to accept help from Sangha, right? I don't think we can do this otherwise. I think there's a reason there's 3 treasures. We need them all. What would others like to say this morning? Either here or out there. I see a hand up. I think it's G again.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So just something that kind of came to mind during this discussion that kind of has helped me. So I can't remember, I think it might have been Donald Lopez, who's a scholar actually here at the University of Michigan. And I think it was him that wrote this article about the Four Noble Truths. And he mentioned not thinking of them as things, but as the 4 ennobling truths. And so I've used that trick sort of to change everything, really all the lists, right? Because Buddhists love lists, into verbs instead of nouns. And so like this idea of right view, when you make it a noun, it's like it's something that is, right? But when you think of right viewing, right, it's like this never ending process, right? That's impermanent. And it's just our practice. It's what we're doing. It's not, we're practicing, right? And so I just wanted to mention that because that's kind of what popped into my mind is that, when we get exhausted like that, it's like, oh, it's so attached to success and failure, this, when things are nouns, whereas when they're processes, we're surfing, we're on the surfboard and we're going up and down and always moving. So anyway, I just wanted to, that's what sort of popped into my mind. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, because it does keep us from grasping something and saying, this is it, I've got it, right? As soon as I grab it, it's dead. So yes, if we view that as a constantly unfolding dynamic activity, that's very helpful. Thank you for that.
And you have to be kind of a grammar nerd to think of things in terms of verbs and nouns. So it helps.
Well, that's actually not an uncommon thing, at least in Western Buddhism. I think Western teachers sometimes I've seen Western teachers make that shift from this is a thing to this is something which unfolds, right? Because nothing is permanent anyway. So, to even say something is a thing is already delusion. So, right, everything is in process all the time. So I think all you're doing is pointing us back toward right view, holding a right view. I heard a voice or somebody else who wanted to say something.
Yeah, that was me. This is Fusats. Thanks so much, Hoko and Genesis. It's very encouraging when I hear younger people speaking about ethics. That it is an aspiration to have that layered into the generational pieces. Gives me some thoughts of that's going to be good for us in the future. So, but one comment, I really appreciated your comment on your element of spiritual health, and I think that's some things that people, myself. I had to start asking myself, well, why am I doing what I'm doing? And why do I believe, what I believe? So I think for me, that is helpful to constantly ask myself that, go back to it and just, root myself in that. And is it in alignment with what I am practicing? So I find that very, very helpful. And I hope that you would share your other 4. This is the first time I've heard you speak about it. But any more comments on that? But I really think now, even, in the discussions that I'm having, locally and, with my friends and my family, I'm like, why is that? I find myself, and a lot of the times people don't even know why they even believe the way they do. So that was very helpful for me. Thank you.
Well, we don't often ask ourselves why, we just accept somehow, the worldviews that we have, which when our practice, which is really interesting, when our practice shows us that something we've deeply held for a long time turns out not actually to be in accord with reality. Whoa. Wow. And maybe that's happened to everybody here, but every once in a while, practice will poke you and go, you know what? That's not actually the case. Oh my God. What else am I holding? What else am I carrying around that is my own creation, right? So in a way, it's scary because this thing you really relied on is somehow not here anymore. And on the other hand, it's kind of encouraging. Oh, wait a minute. There's a lot of other stuff that I could be letting go of. At least that's my experience when that happens, right? I should know the other 4 of those off the top of my head. I can certainly send them to you. There's one in there about, let's see, spiritual health. Understanding like how I'm related to something bigger than me. Understanding where I go, where my resources are. Having some sense of peace and well-being in the world. So it's things like that, and there's a couple more that unfortunately I haven't looked at them lately. And I should know them. I should just know them because I do this for a living, right? Somehow I should know those things, and I just don't. Somehow the one that keeps coming up all the time is this one. Why do I believe what we believe? You know, what do we believe and why? That's the one that somehow, and maybe that's a reflection of my own practice. Maybe that's not actually a reflection of the world. Maybe it's just a reflection of what I teach and how I teach. It's like I'm constantly going, you know, let's poke those things and go, there's that thing that I'm hanging on to. Like, why is that there? And maybe it's fine. I'm certainly not saying we should completely disregard everything we believed up to this point, because our beliefs might be actually completely in accord with reality. So I'm not saying give it all up, but when we look at it closely, you know, I think this is kind of what Buddha was encouraging us to do many times, because he would do like thought experiments with people. He'd say, okay, if this, then this. Do you agree? Yes, that's how that is. And then if this, then that. Don't you think so? Well, yeah, that's actually how my life is. And then he'd go down this thing and go, oh my gosh, this thing I've been carrying around is not actually the way the world works. It's an interesting practice.
It helps your self-esteem. There's a story that Ellen once tells about D.T. Suzuki, who was giving a lecture. And D.T. Suzuki gets to a certain point in the lecture, says, oh, but I can't remember this, but you can look it up.
That's right. We can't remember it all. You know, I can prepare. Doesn't mean I remember it all. Although when you steep yourself in these teachings, things come back to you in ways you didn't expect. What would others like to say? Anything else this morning from anybody? And people at home, I can't necessarily see you, so you might have to just speak up if you need to speak up. Just unmute yourself. And
So I have one follow-up on what Hennesis said also.
Good.
You know, this has come up, I feel like, a lot, you know, and I think especially in our tradition, because we're strange Buddhists in that we've kind of, you know, stopped following most of the precepts that virtually all other Buddhists follow. And I think that we kind of justify these after the fact with various formulations of going beyond distinctions. But if you look at the historical context, it's actually much more kind of less justified than that, you know. So when Japan modernized, basically it was like Buddhists had to, you know, ingratiate themselves to the government and stopped following the precepts so that they could look modern, is what most of our sort of drinking alcohol and eating meat kind of stuff comes from. So, you know, with that, I've kind of myself been trying to follow precepts a little more closely, and I feel like every time that we try to do something like what Hennesis was describing, like bend the rules by saying that, you know, it's serving some greater good, it's you know, it seems like 99% of the time a delusional, you know, justification for bad behavior. So I don't know, what do you think? Do you think that it's good to just sort of recognize the fact that we're mostly, you know, even though we're sort of striving to bring this perspective of emptiness into our lives, in practice we sort of live in the conventional world most of the time and should probably follow the rules kind of with that in mind? At least that's sort of what I've been thinking recently.
oh, I think you're not wrong. I think it's really easy for us to justify the things we want to do. You know, oh well, there's a reason bigger than me for these things that I want to do. I think we see it individually. I think we see it as sanghas. I think we see it as Western practitioners, because you've made reference now to, what I call Soto Zen modernism. It's like how, when we look carefully at how the practice that we do in the West gets shaped, it's pretty surprising. If we think we're doing, an authentic traditional Japanese practice, it's been shaped by any number of quite intentional choices, both Japanese and Western, since before World War II, right? And there were, reasons given, right? There were justifications for why these things should change. There was a real attempt made to create a practice that would be acceptable to Westerners for a lot of reasons, not necessarily because we're going to take it up, because of the way Japanese wanted to be seen, right? So we could say, oh, all those things, were departures. Or we could say, oh, all of those choices that were made for a greater, larger, I think it's really easy to go down that slippery slope. So I think we have to be really careful, if we choose to follow precepts, whether we do that formally in public or not. I think we have to wholeheartedly do that to the best of our ability. Yes, we have to understand precepts are a little bit squishy sometimes, but we can't use that as an excuse to say, well, okay, I did this, I took these precepts, but my real life looks like this. Like, okay, what do I believe and why? Is my practice of the precepts actually a reflection of this one unified reality? Or is it my story about precepts and my story about my practice and what's okay and what's allowable and what's not? It's a really slippery slope. So, Doju, I think you're right. And I think it's a really good reminder to us to go back and say, okay, what would my life be like if I actually wholeheartedly, sincerely tried to follow precepts? There's a reason we do Ryakusatsu every 30 days. It's to remind us what those precepts are. And to remind us that as bodhisattvas, that's what our life looks like. Because it's easy to read them or take them and then put them on the shelf and say, did that, and yet we wear these things, right? So I encourage folks, we do that ceremony once a month here. You can be here, but you can certainly do it virtually. And people do. We have a little core of people that's quite faithful about showing up every 30 days to hear the precepts again, and to make those vows again, and to do vow and repentance again, and to start over, to clean the slate sort of, and to start over. It's a powerful practice. I think it re-centers us, refocuses us on the kind of things that Doju's talking about. So, oh yeah, there's that precept about such and so. Usually we take a little time to talk about at least one of those precepts very briefly. What does it look like in my life? And am I weaseling around on that one? Have I found a way around that one because I can justify it? So looking here is important. So thank you for that reminder, Doju. I think that's important. Anything else today from people here or people not physically here? Genesis, please.
Yeah, so following what Doju said, there is a book that actually talked about that period that I read that actually was quite a profound experience for me, called Zen at War. That talks about
Victoria.
yeah, and it talks a lot about not just the history of Zen Buddhism's involvement in Japanese imperialism, but also the theological justifications and rationales. And I remember when I was reading that, I kind of sometimes caught certain mindsets that I've done for myself on certain things, and it made me sort of question how it's very easy to make things self-serving, and it just as weird as it seemed at first, how all of that could have had these justifications, when I actually read it, I'm like, oh wow, it makes sense how much of a slippery slope this type of reasoning can be. And yeah,
there's always something we can examine. There's always something we can look at. Other things today? We had enough. We all have a right view now. All right, very good. All right, so I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin, and we'll do our closing chants and go on to tea time. So thanks everybody for your practice today and participation. Please please continue your practice.